first met Alan at the Abraham Lincoln Symposium, which is held annually in March in 1998, Alan, March 1998. And I was just bowled over by this superb lecture. I'd never heard of this scholar before. And as Alan will tell you, yeah, I've usually heard of most of the experts in Civil War studies. Alan and I hit it off so well, we started talking after he gave his lecture during the next lecture, and several people came and told us to shut up. We were too noisy during the second lecture, so we did. And we've been talking and dialoguing ever since, 24 years, and it's raced by. Alan was trained as an intellectual historian like I was. I was trained by Kenneth Lynn at Johns Hopkins as an undergrad and grad student, who was Perry Miller's finest student. Alan has reservations about Perry Miller. He may tell you about that later. But Alan studied with the next great intellectual historian of the US, who's still alive, Bruce Kuklick, who is 80 now. And he did this book, Jonathan Edwards on the Will. I'll explain why this book about Jonathan Edwards, America's greatest theologian, it was also a Calvinist, led Alan to Lincoln. Lincoln was raised a Baptist. He was raised a Calvinist in Kentucky. And this is a big reason why both of his parents were anti-slavery. They were hard-shell Baptists. These 4 books by Alan right here, all relating to Lincoln in one way or another. And the first one, this was Alan's first Lincoln Prize winner right here. Lincoln Redeemer President. It studies Lincoln's thought. It's probably the best book on Lincoln's thought. And it sees Lincoln as a man of ideas. Alan loves to quote Richard, I'm trying to think of his name, Alan, it's slipping me. Ideas have consequences.
Richard Weaver.
Richard Weaver. I'm forgetting a fellow Southerner right there. And he cites this to his students. And this book is the best study of Lincoln. He's done another one on Lincoln as a man of ideas too, a short one for Southern Illinois University Press. 3 of the 4 Lincoln volumes I've just shown you, Alan won the Lincoln Prize for. I met Mike Burlingame at the same meeting in March of 1998, but I'll wait and share what's interesting about Mike when I introduce him. But Alan's from Philadelphia. He has 2 degrees from the University of Pennsylvania, but Alan is a great lecturer. He's the greatest intellectual historian of the US of his generation. He's succeeded both Kuklick and Alan and Kenneth Lynn. And I've been blessed by having Alan as a friend, and I think you'll truly enjoy this lecture. He's a great lecturer, not just a good one, a great one. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, well, that sounds like the pistol that they fire off at the races for people to start running. So I shall start running, but at least with this preface. First of all, to thank Chris for that irrationally generous introduction, but also to thank both the Civil War Roundtable and the Lincoln Group for the opportunity to speak to them again. It's been many years since I spoke to the Lincoln Group. This actually goes back, I think, if my memory is not playing too many tricks, to 2008, when we were meeting at Fort Leslie McNair. And once again, after the passage of time, here we are again, and I'm very glad to be with so many devoted students of Abraham Lincoln. I will try to contribute a small mite to our further understanding of the 16th president today. What if Lincoln had lived? The round lead 41 caliber bullet, which John Wilkes Booth fired into the head of Abraham Lincoln on the night of April 14th, 1865, was the most lethal gunshot in American history. Only 5 days before, the main field army of the Southern Confederacy had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. And the 4 dreary years of civil war between North and South were yielding to a spring of national rebirth. But now, the man to whom everyone looked for guidance in reconstructing the nation in reconciliation and happiness was dead, even before the victory illuminations had burned themselves out. The result was a costly but successful war, followed by a botched and even more costly reconstruction. Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, took the presidential oath within hours of Lincoln's death, but Johnson had none of Lincoln's political skills, much less Lincoln's convictions about justice and equality for the 4 million slaves whom the Civil War had freed. By the time Johnson left office in 1869, the pace of Reconstruction was already faltering, and Johnson had become so despised that he barely survived an impeachment. Would it have been different if Booth's bullet had missed? Especially having guided the nation through a wartime valley of shadows, could Lincoln have found, as he once described it, some practical system by which the two races could gradually live themselves out of their old relation to each other and both come out better prepared for the new? Lincoln never laid out a final, definitive plan for Reconstruction. In fact, there was some question whether he had any business laying out such plans, since Congress was not shy about asserting its jurisdiction over any Reconstruction process. He tinkered in the first place with the idea of imposing temporary military governments in the Southern Territory reclaimed by early Union victories in 1862. But these military governments had a spotty record, and Congress balked at receiving the representatives elected under their aegis. Lincoln then turned to encouraging Southern Unionists in occupied territory to begin forming their own governments, calling state conventions to write slavery out of their state documents and electing more rounds of representatives. But these experiments did not shine any brighter, and predictably, Congress, for the most part, refused to seat the representatives they elected. In his last public speech on April 11th, 1865, Lincoln hinted broadly that he had some new announcement to make to the people of the South about Reconstruction, which would include voting rights for the freedmen. I would myself prefer that it were now, the vote, conferred on the very intelligent, he said, and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. But Lincoln had nothing more specific than that to offer. In fact, he was trying as hard as he could not to be too specific. This vagueness was partly a political habit of Lincoln's. He had learned in politics that laying down one's cards too early was an invitation to be outbid. And it was partly a matter of temperament, since Lincoln was an exceedingly private man who resisted any great amount of self-disclosure. There can hardly be a greater example of raw historical presumption than the certain prediction of what Lincoln would have done had he lived to direct Reconstruction as he had the Civil War. Still, there is no other question that I'm asked more often than, what if Lincoln had lived? What would Lincoln have done differently, or more wisely, than Andrew Johnson? And what better kind of America might we be living in as a result? Well, I'll confess that it's hard enough to get agreement on what did happen in the past without speculating on what didn't. But I will suggest that the evidence points us toward 4 paths to Reconstruction that Lincoln might well have adopted. First concerns voting rights. If there was an emotional guiding star in Lincoln's life, it was loyalty. And that admiration of loyalty in the Black soldier, more than anything else, was what persuaded Lincoln that there was no real alternative, especially for those Blacks who had worn the Union blue, but to reward that service with full civil rights, voting rights especially. If the Confederates wanted amnesty, Lincoln said, he could not avoid exacting in return universal suffrage, or at least suffrage on the basis of intelligence and military service. But there was also a practical political motive that argued in favor of promoting Black voting rights. Once the war was over and the Southern states reabsorbed into the Union, they would elect representatives and senators to send back to Washington. But if the freed slaves were excluded from the vote, then Even after the most prominent Confederates were banned from holding public office, Southerners would still likely vote only for the same white Democrats who had demanded secession in the first place. What was worse, before the war, the Southern states had been restricted from counting more than 3/5 of their slaves for determining the number of representatives from their states. With the end of slavery, these same white Southerners could now claim authority to count 5/5 of their Black populations without still giving them any say in the voting process. The result would be not only a return of revanchist whites to Congress, but more of them than ever before. Only the voting power of the newly freed slaves could offset the political dominance of unbowed whites in the South. The freedmen would then, as Frederick Douglass promised, raise up a party in the Southern states among the poor and establish a long-term Republican political hegemony in the formerly Democratic South. Give the Negro the elective franchise, said Douglass, and you at once wheel the Southern states into line with national interests and national objects. Had Lincoln lived, both his own sense of fairness and the political needs of his own administration would have made Black voting rights an imperative that they never were for Andrew Johnson. A second path that we might be able to discern would have been economic integration. Economic independence is what gives heft to political aspiration, something Lincoln understood from his own struggle to rise from poverty. In his debates with Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln insisted that even if the Black man is not my equal in many respects, nevertheless, in the right to eat the bread without leave of anybody else, which his own hand earns, he is my equal and the equal of Judge Douglas and the equal of every living man. 2 years after that, Lincoln had said, I want every man to have the chance, and I believe a Black man is entitled to it, in which he can better his condition. One crucial aspect of economic integration would be education, giving, as Lincoln said, the benefit of public schools equally to Black and white. And in his last speech, he raised that to a level equal in importance to that of voting. But in Lincoln's world, economic opportunity was tied overwhelmingly to the ownership of land, and the newly freed slaves owned none. The means for redressing this imbalance lay close at hand in the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, known simply as the Freedmen's Bureau, which was launched on May 3rd, 1865, with a mandate to claim land which had been abandoned by plantation owners or which had been forfeited by non-payment of taxes during the war, and divide it up in 40-acre plots for ex-slaves to farm as their own. Lincoln, in his career as an attorney for the Illinois Central Railroad, had no qualms about the eviction of non-productive squatters and occupiers from lands which the railroad claimed and proposed turning into productive roadways. In equal right, better is the condition of him in possession, he wrote in Legal Opinion in 1856. And if the lands of the South had been vacated by slave owners, there was no one better to put in ownership than the ex-slaves who had once worked them. A third path, if Lincoln had lived, would concern Western development. The Civil War actually sprang from the dispute of free and slave states over the future of the Western territories. And Lincoln regarded the West as an integral part of Reconstruction. He signed homestead legislation that opened huge tracts of public land to private ownership. And he pledged government support to a transcontinental railroad which would carry the harvests of those homesteads to world markets. Turning the freedmen's gaze westward as well would accomplish the same goal as the Freedmen's Bureau. The Homestead Act of May 20th, 1862, allowed virtually anyone, including women, to lay claim to over 270 million acres of publicly owned land in 30 states, provided only that they were 21 years of age and that they had pledged to settle the land for 5 years. For Union Army veterans, the residency requirement was only 1 year. But when the Freedmen's Bureau's director, the evangelical abolitionist general Oliver Otis Howard, pressed to open public lands in Florida, Mississippi, and Arkansas for the resettlement of freed slaves, Andrew Johnson vetoed it. A second endeavor to create what amounted to a domestic form of colonization emerged out of Congress in 1866 with the Southern Homestead Act, which opened 46 million acres of public land in Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas to Black veterans and white Southern loyalists. But only 6,500 claims were actually filed. Land ownership by Blacks lagged far, far behind that of whites in the post-war decades. And only a determined push by the federal government in privatizing land in the West for the freed slaves could have changed that. From Andrew Johnson, nothing of that sort could have been expected. From Lincoln, it would not be too hard to imagine Lincoln, had he lived, presiding at the ceremonies at Promontory Summit, Utah in 1869, driving the golden spike that united the Transcontinental Railroad with two Black Westerners with malls on either side of him. One more way that we could see Abraham Lincoln, if he had lived, presiding over Reconstruction, would concern cleaning the Confederate slate. Lincoln was not exaggerating in his second inaugural address when he spoke of his hope of malice toward none and charity for all at the close of the war. He had no wish to hunt down the Confederacy's leaders as the war ended, but he also had no wish to stop them leaving for exile. Frighten them out of the country, he said. Open the gates, let down the bars, scare them off. This would clear the way for a new leadership in the South, a leadership of Unionist whites and their natural allies, the freed slaves. Andrew Johnson's pardon policies, however, were another matter. Under the terms of Johnson's pardons, Alexander Stephens, former Confederate vice president and now pardoned by Johnson, was elected by the Georgia legislature to the Senate. Herschel V. Johnson, who had sat in the Confederate Congress, was elected to the other Georgia Senate seat. In the House of Representatives, Colin Battle, until recently a Confederate general, showed up to represent Alabama. William T. Wofford, who commanded a Confederate brigade at Gettysburg, was there for Georgia. 2 of Virginia's 8 representatives had been members of the state secession convention in 1861. Appalled at the barefaced arrogance of electing to Congress men who only months before had been trying to destroy the government, Republicans in Congress refused to seat the quondam rebels and instead passed legislation which returned the southern states to military occupation. But they did so at the price of a fearful political contest with President Johnson, which allowed disgruntled Southerners to realize that they could play the ends off against the middle to their advantage. The eventual restoration of white supremacy in the former Confederacy is a reminder that even if Lincoln had lived to finish out his second term and put an active presidential shoulder to Black voting rights, to Black economic integration, to Black involvement in Western expansion, and to the wiping clean of the old white Confederate leadership, the results might not have been hugely different from what they were. The eventual return of Southern representatives to Congress, which sooner or later would have occurred, even if the most diehard Confederates had been weeded out, would still further dilute the congressional majorities with which Lincoln had worked during the war. And if Northern Democrats were able to scramble back to their feet politically, Lincoln would face much heavier going for Reconstruction policies than he had for wartime policies. Similarly, Lincoln could scarcely have guaranteed the operation of any practical system of racial reunion without an ongoing military presence in the South to enforce it. Yet, Americans were chronically unwilling in times of peace to foot large military budgets. And the soldiers themselves were mostly civilians in uniform who wanted nothing more than to go home at war's end. Above all, Lincoln would have occupied the executive mansion only until 1869, which is not a long time to implement the vast programs his version of Reconstruction would have required. In the end, not even Abraham Lincoln might have been able to bulldoze his way to a triumphant mission accomplished. And yet, it is hard to imagine how he could have done worse. Had Mr. Lincoln lived, said Frederick Douglass in December of 1865, the Negro of the South would have had more hope of enfranchisement, and no rebels would hold the reins of government in any one of the rebellious states. This, said Douglass, was because Lincoln was a humane man, an honorable man, and at heart an anti-slavery man who looked to the principles of liberty and justice for the peace, security, happiness, and prosperity of his country. 150 years later, we are still struggling to live up to that expectation. Thank you very much, and I will turn matters back over to Chris and to Michael.
Hey, Mike, you look well.
Thank you. You do too.
Okay. I met Mike Burlingame at the same Abraham Lincoln Symposium in March 1998. Our friendship has ripened too. It was quicker with Alan, but one thing Mike and I have in common, we both studied with the eminent Kenneth Lune at Johns Hopkins. He's a native, Michael's a native of North Arlington. He went to Washington and Lee High School. And then Michael went to Princeton. He graduated at only 21 in 1962 with studying under both David Donald, the Civil War historian, but also with James Billington, the future Librarian of Congress. But Michael's great contribution, and he and Alan are both close friends, is to go in depth, especially he studied with Kenneth and also David Donald, both top Lincoln scholars, but Kenneth was more sympathetic to his first book, his psychological profile of Abraham Lincoln. He goes in for depth psychology of his subjects. And nobody had really done this with Lincoln before. Michael did it with a book published. Was it the University of Illinois Press?
That's first correct.
One? Right. But that led to Michael's triumph, which won the Lincoln Prize, which he calls The Green Monster. And these two volumes measure about 2,200 pages. This is the most thorough and complete biography of Abraham Lincoln. It was published in 2008. It won the Lincoln Prize, just as Alan won it 3 times with his various volumes. And I hope the two of you tie with your 3 books, the ones you published the last few months for the next Lincoln Prize. Michael is very, very thorough. In fact, he discovered in The Green Monster, in this biography of Lincoln, he was able to, by historical detection, detect Lincoln's unsigned editorials in newspapers, in Illinois newspapers. And so no one's more thoroughly reconstructed the unknown years of Lincoln's life, the 1830s and 1840s and early 1850s than Michael, before the Kansas-Nebraska Act, when Lincoln became political again, because after he gave up his House seat during the Mexican War, he gave up politics and just practiced law with the Illinois Central Railroad. And now Michael's just written 2 books, one about Mary Todd Lincoln, about Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln's marriage, and the other one is about Abraham Lincoln's relations with Black people. These 2 books couldn't be more topical. I give you Michael Burlingame, who takes the familiar and dives deeply and shows us how complex, what's the complex reality behind what we think is familiar, especially with the Lincoln and his relatives.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Chris, for that very kind and generous introduction. I just would like to add a footnote. I actually went to Phillips Academy, Andover for high school, and my brother went to Washington and Lee. So I attended it only through what he learned there and what he taught me. But in any event, and also I would like to thank the Lincoln Group of Washington for inviting me back to speak yet again. It's always an honor to be invited to speak to such a group, but it's a special honor to be invited back to speak to such a group. And so I thank you kindly. And I relish every opportunity that I can get to speak about my favorite subject without having to grade any of my listeners' exams or papers. So let me talk primarily about my more recent book, which is called The Black Man's President, Abraham Lincoln, African Americans, and the Pursuit of Racial Equality. And the central thesis of it is that Abraham Lincoln was instinctively a racial egalitarian. And the approach I take is somewhat different from previous scholars. That is to say, instead of examining in detail Lincoln's speeches and writings and policies and appointments in order to determine whether Lincoln was a racist or not, I operate on the assumption that interactions speak louder than words, and that what Lincoln's interactions with Black people in both Springfield and Washington tells us is truly revealing of his true feelings. And the first 200 pages of this book deals with those interactions. How did he deal with the people he met with, worked with, hired, associated with, and lived near in Springfield? And then on to Washington and how he dealt with the people Black people who called on him in Washington, with whom he interacted on the White House staff and the like. And the striking feature of all these interactions is that the people with whom he interacted uniformly, when interviewed or writing their own memoirs, praised him for his utter lack of prejudice, his cordiality, his lack of condescension, his ability to relate without, as Frederick Douglass said, making him feel at all self-conscious about his race. Sojourner Truth saying something similar. She's never met a more kindly a white person who had ever treated her more kindly. And then the appendix to the book is about 40 pages, and it deals with the purported evidence showing that Lincoln was a racist. But what I'd like to talk to you in this next 15 minutes or so is about those interactions and about misunderstandings regarding the subject of Lincoln's interaction with Black people. Now, one of the more prominent misunderstandings is Lincoln's relation to Springfield Blacks. It's been said by very knowledgeable historians like Benjamin Quarles, David Donald, Jim Oakes, and the like, that Lincoln's exposure to Black people in Springfield was to Black people who weren't particularly impressive compared to the people that he met in Washington, like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Bishop Payne, and others. And that therefore he developed in Springfield a kind of attitude toward Black people that wasn't particularly egalitarian. But then coming to Washington and being exposed to people like Frederick Douglass and various others that I'll mention as we pass along, that his attitude toward race became more enlightened. In fact, that doesn't seem to be the case. That if you look closely at Lincoln's interaction with Black people in Springfield, and I have to pay tribute here to a friend of mine, an attorney and amateur historian in Springfield, Richard Hart, who's done pioneering work on the Black community in Springfield in Lincoln's time and Lincoln's relationship with those people. There's several that he interacted with. He lived in a racially integrated neighborhood. He had Black neighbors with half a block away down the street. And these people that he knew were not as David Donald, alas, says in his biography of Lincoln, people who would never think of asserting themselves and acting with the kind of dignity and self-respect and assertiveness that he would experience in Washington. Whereas, in fact, the neighbor who was half a block away was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. His bootmaker was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. His handyman who painted the fences and took care of the yard and all that was also a minister and a conductor on the Underground Railroad. These were not passive step and fetch it people. Those Black people that he did know in Springfield who were interviewed and did talk about their interactions with Lincoln were uniformly laudatory of Lincoln's egalitarianism and the respect and courtesy that he showed them. And that the servant said he never gave orders, he always made requests and treated us like human beings and not inferiors. And his relationship with Black people in Springfield also included real friendships. And we have excellent evidence about this because his barber, William Florville, informally known as Billy the Barber, wrote a letter to Lincoln in December of 1863, a long letter with a very warm feeling tone describing how things have been going in Springfield, praising Lincoln for having issued the Emancipation Proclamation, describing his sorrow at the news that Willie Lincoln had died, and praising Willie as a boy of exceptional merit, far beyond his years, talking about how the boy's dog, Fido, was being well cared for, about how his house, which he had sublet, was being well cared for because the people who were in it didn't have children to ruin things, as he put it in this letter. And that if you look at that letter and read between the lines, the warmth and the friendship is quite striking. So, and Lincoln also had Black clients, not many, but some came to him for legal advice. A woman named Mary Shelby comes to him for a divorce and he facilitates it. And then 15 years later, she comes saying, my son has been arrested in New Orleans and jailed and will be enslaved if he doesn't pay his fine. And could you help out? And Lincoln knocks himself out to rescue this son of Mary Shelby and does succeed in doing so. And Billy the Barber was one of his clients too. Billy the Barber owned some land in nearby Bloomington, and Lincoln helped him secure a title to that land and then helped make sure that the taxes got paid. So Lincoln's experience of Black people, and in addition to all that, is he saw Black people regularly when he was walking from his house at 8th and Jackson over to 5th and Adams to his office, and would interact with them, say hello, and that kind of exposure oftentimes acts as a solvent on any kind of stereotyping and prejudice. So when Lincoln leaves Springfield and goes to Washington, he is not somebody who's been raised in the boondocks and who regards Blacks as inherently inferior. Au contraire. And then when he gets to Washington, he then, among other things, throws open the White House to any Black guests who want to come to receptions. And there's a widespread misunderstanding about Lincoln and White House receptions. Nell Irvin Painter and other historians will tell you with the utmost authority that there were no Blacks invited to Washington receptions during the Lincoln period. It was not allowed. Well, that's nonsense. There were at least 5 occasions when Blacks attended White House receptions during Lincoln's day. And one of the most famous episodes is one that you're probably familiar with that occurred after Lincoln's second inaugural on March 4th, 1865. Frederick Douglass was in the audience. Then his friends urged him to go to the reception. Douglass said, well, I would like to be an icebreaker. Douglass thought that he was breaking precedent, whereas in fact, there had been 4 earlier receptions where Black people were admitted to the White House for receptions. Anyway, so Douglass goes, and as you probably know the story, he was told by the police that he was not allowed in. Douglass then asks a passerby friend whom he knows to please tell the president that Frederick Douglass is being denied admittance And Lincoln, as soon as he hears about that, immediately sends word, admit him. And so Douglas then comes to the reception area, and he sees Lincoln as this long reception line, and Douglas heads toward it, and Lincoln says, no, stop, Douglas, come here. And Douglas says, Mr. President, I can't jump the line. I can't feel comfortable doing that. And he says, no, come, Douglas, please. There's no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours. And I saw you in the audience today, and I want to learn, what did you think of my address? And I have this fantasy that Douglas was thinking to himself, well, actually, I thought the syntax in the penultimate paragraph was a little tangled, and that the statement that you quote from Jesus isn't quite apropos for the situation that you described. But no, he doesn't say anything like that. He says, it was a sacred effort, Mr. President. But in point of fact, as I say, there were 4 other occasions that are recorded when Blacks came to the White House. One of them was a New Year's reception in 1864. And a couple of Boston abolitionists, one of them rather prominent, came. A month later, in February of 1864, 2 Black physicians in the Army come, and they were quite self-consciously trying to break the ice. The New Year's reception on 1865 saw many Blacks come to the White House, and several were admitted. But then, after a brief period, they were then shunted aside because of Mrs. Lincoln's objections. And then the following month, in February of 1865, a Black gentleman from New York attends a White House reception. And so the notion that there was a ban on the admission of Blacks to receptions is a mistake. Now, it's widely known by students of American history that when Theodore Roosevelt invited a Black man, Booker T. Washington, to dinner, there was a huge uproar. But what is not so well known is that when Lincoln invited Blacks to the White House, particularly at those receptions, there was also a huge uproar. The Democrats went ballistic. They said, "Oh, this is appalling. This is an example of Lincoln's egalitarianism, that he's run amok, and that he's a champion of Black equality, and isn't this an outrage?" So the receptions that Lincoln, at which he presided, and then when Blacks came to talk to him, to ask favors, for example, to use the White House grounds for fundraisers for Black churches, Lincoln said, "Sure, of course." Well, that caused a big uproar. And when Lincoln uses the White House and actually summons Blacks to the White House to consult on public affairs, that raises a huge uproar. And one of those occasions in which he does encourage and invite the Blacks to come to the White House is in August of 1862. He wished to convey these Black leaders in Washington a plan he had to encourage colonization in Panama. That creates a huge uproar. So that colonization issue, by the way, is widely misunderstood. It's often said that Lincoln was an ardent colonizationist from way back. That's not true. Lincoln did not join a colonization society until the 1850s. He passed up an opportunity to be involved in any of three of them that were established in central Illinois in the 1830s and 40s. And when he does address a colonization society in 1855, it's very lukewarm. He says, well, maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's not. Some people like it, some people don't. The misunderstanding of Lincoln and colonization is widespread. Colonization is oftentimes thought of as a kind of form of ethnic cleansing, just get rid of all Black people. And for some colonizations, that was true, but not for Lincoln. Lincoln regarded colonization and his support of it as a way to help pave the way for emancipation by assuring whites particularly in the border slave states in the lower North, that once emancipation came, it would not be accompanied by a tsunami of Black former slaves flooding the North. Another aspect of Lincoln's support for colonization is he believed that white racism was so deep-seated and so widespread that there were many Blacks who understandably believed that they would never get a fair shake in the United States. They would never achieve first-class citizenship. And he believed that it was the government's obligation and duty to provide those Black pessimists with some opportunity to live in this country and in a society where they would not be treated like second-class citizens. And another aspect of colonization, which is not understood, is that when Lincoln actually does carry out one colonization plan to Haiti, it was because the people who had been suffering badly in contraband camps, that is slave refugee camps, terrible disease, high death rates, awful conditions, that it was better to allow a group to go to Haiti than to continue to suffer in contraband camps. So that Lincoln's support was humanitarian and hardly an index of racism. And then another thing is that Lincoln was not only just courteous and kind and considerate to Black people who came to the White House, he also took their policy recommendations seriously. In March of 1864, two Black gentlemen from New Orleans come and present a petition with 1,000 signatures from Black men in New Orleans saying, look, we're property owners, we are literate, and we would like the right to vote. We served, or our fathers served as troops helping Andrew Jackson repel the British in 1815, and we'd like the right to vote. And Lincoln tells these gentlemen, I'm very sympathetic, but states and not the federal government control who gets to vote in federal elections. And so what you ought to do is to go get the Constitutional Convention that's about to meet and have them authorize Black voting. And then Lincoln, a few days later, then writes to the governor of Louisiana and says, you're going to have a Constitutional Convention. I would like to see a provision that Black people will be allowed to vote. The governor then uses that and helps persuade the Constitutional Convention not to allow voting, but to come closer to it than they were to begin with. And then that recommendation, as Alan was saying in that brilliant, Alan, that was a brilliant summary and very comprehensive in a very short compass. So I was really taken away and blown away. It was really excellent. Lincoln then says publicly on April 11th, 1865, the same thing he said to the governor in that letter. I believe Black people should be allowed to vote, at least the veterans of the Union Army and the very intelligent, by which he meant the literate. Now, Frederick Douglass that day was in the audience, and he later said in a speech that Alan quoted in December 65, I didn't appreciate how significant Lincoln's call for limited Black suffrage was, because I was disappointed, as were my abolitionist friends, in the limited scope. Only the veterans of the Union Army, only the literate. But we should have realized that that was an extremely important speech, because Abraham Lincoln learns his statesmanship in the school of rail splitting. And to split a rail, you take a wedge and you insert the thin edge of the wedge into the log. Having done that, then you take a hammer, a maul, and you drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And we should have known that day that Lincoln was inserting the thin edge of the wedge. And having done that publicly, we could count on him to drive it home and go far beyond the limited scope that he had initially mentioned. And so Douglas is very regretful that he didn't appreciate the significance of that speech when he heard it. But there was a person in the audience who did appreciate it, and that was John Wilkes Booth. And John Wilkes Booth hears this appeal or this endorsement of limited Black suffrage, and he turns to his companions and says, that means N-word citizenship. By God, that's the last speech he's ever going to give, and I'm going to run him through. And 3 days later, he carries that out and murders Lincoln, not because Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves in the Confederacy state, most of the Confederate states, not because he facilitated the passage of the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery everywhere, including the border slave states. He murdered him because he called for Black voting rights. And therefore, I think it's appropriate for us in the 21st century to regard Abraham Lincoln as much of a martyr to Black civil rights as Martin Luther King or Medgar Evers or any of those other people who were murdered in the 1960s as champions of the civil rights revolution of that time. And I thank you for your attention.
So both of those were great presentations, and there were a lot of questions already in the chat, and I do want to get to those, but I do want to take advantage of the fact that we have two great Lincoln scholars here, and you have books, and I do want to get to Alan's new book as well. But I suggest to start off, Alan, Michael had just gone through and given his basis really for why Lincoln should be considered to be a racial egalitarian in most ways, at least, and even a civil rights icon that he was mentioning. Do you think that's persuasive? Do you agree with him on that, or do you have a different view or an expanded view on whether Lincoln was a racist or an egalitarian?
Well, in the 19th century, these are categories that sometimes have what you might call overlap or even bleed into with each other. There are a number of people who are remarkably enlightened on the subject of race. There are vehement abolitionists, and they are, as William Lloyd Garrison himself was, at the same time, in practical relations with Black people, he could be condescending, he could be intimidating, he could be dismissive. So trying to define a fixed quantity this way and call this racism, or define a fixed quantity and call this abolitionism, that's probably asking more of human beings than they really can give. Human beings are much more fluid, much more interactive between categories like that. That's a very long way of saying that, taken on the whole, I think that Michael is right. I think that Lincoln is much more at ease with the notion of racial equality, of racial egalitarianism, and in two respects. One is that he really starts off from a base of egalitarianism, and that is a conviction in the natural equality that Black and white have simply by virtue of being human beings. Everyone is born with certain natural rights. It's like being hardwired with them. And among those natural rights, as we know from the Declaration of Independence, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A natural right to liberty is incompatible with slavery. So a commitment to a natural egalitarianism is, in large measure, what pushes Lincoln into his anti-slavery career. He simply can't avoid the logic of that. But then beyond natural egalitarianism, we have to start talking about civil egalitarianism. Now this, at first in the 1850s, is really not on Lincoln's screen. He will talk about natural egalitarianism and rebut Stephen A. Douglas on this particular subject when he says that the Black man is, in respect of his right to earn and eat the bread which he earns by the fruit of his labor, he is my equal, Judge Douglas's equal, and the equal of every living man. All right, that's natural egalitarianism. But during the war, there's an important thing that happens, and that is the Black soldier. And the one thing that Lincoln cannot deny is what the Black soldier has won for himself in the course of the war. And he says very close to the end of the war, this is actually January of 1864, in a letter to General James Wadsworth, he says, if the rebels expect me to show them any kind of amnesty, any kind of reconciliation, it's going to have to come at the cost of Black voting rights and Black egalitarianism. And he puts an even more sharp point on that when he's in Richmond in the last week of his life, when he does that impromptu visit from the James River up into the ruins of Richmond. The crowds of now freed slaves who come around him, they gather around him, they're praising him. It's as though it's the second coming. His response to them, according to David Dixon Porter, and this is Porter's reminiscence of this, Lincoln says, "You shall have all the rights of all American citizens. You have earned that. You know, don't bow to me, bow to God, but you shall have all the rights of American citizens." So I think what you see in Lincoln is The logic of his position about natural egalitarianism is what is eventually going to prepare him to start talking about civil egalitarianism. And the key factor in that transition is the service of the Black soldier, which he simply cannot deny, both for its strategic significance, but also for the moral meaning of what happens when you put your life on the line for the sake of the country.
Thank you for that additional nuance. I mean, I guess one of the things we have to keep reminding ourselves in the 21st century is that our definitions of race, racism, egalitarianism, and all of these things may not really even mean much for the mid-19th century. And we have to be careful that we can place ourselves into that time period somewhat. Michael, Ellen talked about four different ways that Lincoln, four different paths that Lincoln may have taken to that would have made Reconstruction differently, different than that worked out with Andrew Johnson at the helm. Do you think that any of those ways would have led to a different way of Reconstruction had Lincoln lived?
Oh, absolutely. And Alan was brilliant in extending the usual arguments in this regard, focus on civil rights, voting rights. But then Alan's analysis of the economic path of Western use of Western lands and the like was a brilliant expansion of the kind of scope that is usually addressed by historians who attack this question. So yes, there was a strong possibility that under his leadership, the chances of any one of those four paths being followed was very strong. But his caveat at the end, saying that, suggesting that the depth of white racism, the depth of the desire of white Americans to bring all the soldiers home, the reluctance to impose federal restrictions for a long time on states that was a problem that may have made it impossible for Lincoln to have achieved those ends fully, but at least he would have made a stab at it and may well have been successful, at least on one or two of those four fronts.
You know, it begs the question, and for both of you, I guess, is if Lincoln had still been around, would the radical Republicans in Congress, for example, worked with Lincoln better than they worked with Andrew Johnson? I mean, they had pretty strong views on punishing the South, and Lincoln, as I understand it, is not so much about punishing, but actually reconstructing and bringing them back in as fellow citizens. I guess for either one of you, whichever one wants to talk first, I mean, do you think that they would have worked well with, he would have been able to work better with Congress in order to move forward, with the same caveats that Ellen mentioned about as states came back in, they now got 5/5 of the African-American population who still didn't have any real representation, but it would give more power to the people who did have the vote.
Alan, it's your turn.
All right. Well, let me at least say this. When we talk about Reconstruction, conventionally speaking, we're talking about a period from 1865 to 1877. We're talking 12 years, in other words. 12 years is not a long time to accomplish a Reconstruction. I mean, that's something we learned at the end of the Second World War when we did it right. It's also something we learned in the wake of World War I when we did it wrong. Look what we got as a result of not doing Reconstruction properly in World War I. The result was very different from World War II. In the years after the war and after his presidency, Ulysses Grant reflected back on this. And Grant very frankly said, we were in too much of a hurry. We really needed to have put into place a long-term military occupation of the former Confederacy. It might have needed to have lasted at least 30 years, perhaps a political generation, so that a new generation of Southern leadership could grow up in an entirely different environment with entirely different attitudes and develop an entirely different economic, political, and social system. That would have required a lot. It would have required the deployment of much more in the way of military force than we did in Reconstruction. I mean, at its height, we were only using about 17,000 United States soldiers in Reconstruction. And when you parcel that out among the Confederate states, I mean, we're talking perhaps a company in each county. That's almost ludicrous on its own terms. Now, we really needed to do something more definite, and Grant recognized that. We were just in too much of a hurry. But the truth is that we are not terribly good at designing reconstructions. We are an impatient people. We want results quickly. And the soldiers, who were for the most part volunteers, wanted to go home. We wanted to cut back on the expenses. And so we did. Well, we cut back on the expenses, but what we got was something substantially more expensive than we had anticipated. And that is this long-term legacy that Reconstruction has left with the United States. It could have been very different, and Grant saw that. But look, there was no template in 1865. You couldn't walk into a bookstore and buy Reconstruction for Dummies. So people did not, so much of Reconstruction is improv. And you watch how Reconstruction, when it does get done, it's being done one step at a time. It's, oh, we've thought of this. Now we need to think about this. Oh, we need to think about one more thing. We've got a 13th Amendment. Wait, we need a 14th Amendment. Oh, hold on. We're going to have to go to a 15th Amendment. That's not because people were necessarily unintelligent. It's that this was an unprecedented situation, both politically and constitutionally. So there's a lot of fumbling. There are numerous mistakes. I would like to think the mistakes would have been fewer had Lincoln been in charge of things. Would he have been able to deal more readily with the radical Republicans? Well, he often said the radical Republicans were the unhandiest set of devils in the world. But he did allow, but they are facing Zionwards.
Right.
And he had his own way of dealing with Congress. I mean, the radical Republicans would do terrible things trying to obstruct him, and he always managed to find a way around them, to the point where Bluff Ben Wade complained one day on the floor of the Senate about what he called Lincoln's back kitchen way of handling Congress. And Lincoln knew how to get his way, and he knew how to make things happen. And he knew how to bend even the radical Republicans to his policies. But the question is always going to come back to the matter of, was there time? Were there resources that were being deployed to make a just Reconstruction happen? And that just did not happen, and it was not going to happen with Andrew Johnson on the watch.
And it may have been very hard, even with Lincoln cooperating with the radicals, because when I was in school, this is 60 years ago, we were taught that Andrew Johnson was crucified by Congress because he tried to implement Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, which on the surface has a certain plausibility because Lincoln outlines a rather generous, mild set of peace terms in December '63, which is widely misunderstood. It was designed to facilitate the end of the war, to offer generous terms would encourage Confederates who had to realize after Gettysburg and Vicksburg and Port Hudson and Chattanooga that there's no way they're going to win on the battlefield. And who wants to be the last soldier killed in the war? So if you offer a generous set of peace terms, then they're more likely to say, all right, we've had it, we surrender. But by April 9th, 1865, there was no longer any need to inveigle people into surrendering. They had been forced into surrendering by Sherman and Sheridan and Thomas and Grant. And so what does he do 2 days after Lee surrenders? He makes a very big gesture toward cooperation with the radicals by saying he believes in black voting rights. So Lincoln might well have cooperated with the radicals, but the both of them together, combined with the respect for states' rights, the respect for property rights, the respect for having a minimal federal army, may have defeated even the best intentions of the radicals and Lincoln combined.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe that we would be able to put a sufficient force into the South to for 30 years of basically military enforcement. And find that hard to fathom that would have flown at all. Michael, let me ask you this. Craig Howell has a question here, and he says that some years back he heard Harold Holzer claim that he doubted the authenticity of that story where John Wilkes Booth told Paine after hearing Lincoln's April 11th speech at the White House that story may be apocryphal and didn't actually happen. What's your view on that? How reliable is that particular statement?
Well, I've asked Terry Alford this very question, and as you doubtless know, Terry is the leading biographer of John Wilkes Booth, and he says, "Well, you look at the source. I mean, one of them is a statement that Davy Harold makes to his attorney, who then shares that with a journalist. So you've got Davy Harold. Then Davy Harold was there. Now, it's not directly from Davy Harold, it's to his lawyer, who's then to a journalist, so it's third hand. But is it plausible? Would Booth have reacted that way to the suggestion that blacks have? Of course, Booth was a rabid racist. And the other quote comes from Lewis Powell, and one of his jailers, conversation. So if you got Powell and Davy Harold as your sources, and it fits with what we know about the rabid racism of and rabid hatred, personal hatred of Lincoln on top of his general racism. The quality of the sources and the plausibility given what we know about Booth seems to me and to Terry Alford pretty convincing.
There's so many questions here. I'm going to try to get people to chime in at some point here, but there's so many questions that it's hard to do. So, but a few people have asked, is what's the difference really between an abolitionist and somebody who's anti-slavery? Can you be anti-slavery and not be abolitionist?
Oh yeah. I mean, anti-slavery was a spectrum of opinion, and it ran all the way from the people that we call the abolitionists, who wanted the immediate, uncompensated, non-gradual ending of slavery, period. All right, that's abolitionism. But you start to move along the spectrum, and you get people who are willing to say, well, yes, I'm opposed to slavery, but I think that emancipation should come on a gradual timetable. Maybe 25 years, maybe 50 years. Then you have people who say, yes, you should have emancipation, but it should come with compensation to the owners. So there has to be some kind of financial package that is offered. Then there will be others who will say, well, yes, we should have emancipation, but it should be immediately followed by compulsory deportation of the slaves. And finally, you get far enough along on that spectrum where you really get people who just don't like slavery, but they're just not going to do anything about it. I mean, this is simply to describe the way that political opinions tend to fall out on almost any issue. On almost any issue, there's a spectrum of people that run from the activists to the people who just kind of sit there and nod yes. And that is the bracket in which we have this thing which we call anti-slavery and abolitionist. Not everybody who opposed slavery was an abolitionist. Not everybody who opposed slavery was really interested in seeing slavery be terminated. Some of them were perfectly happy to oppose slavery being put next door to them. And there are plenty of people in Illinois who were anti-slavery. Doesn't mean they wanted to end slavery. What it meant was they didn't want slave labor in Illinois, and they didn't want slave labor in the Western territories because they were planning to migrate there themselves. They didn't want the competition with slave labor. But that didn't mean that they were entertaining any kind of egalitarian notions about the future of Black people. They simply didn't like slavery. So it does exist on a spectrum. And the actual number of people that we can count as thoroughgoing, completely committed, consistent abolitionists is comparatively small. Lincoln himself pulled shy of talking about himself as an abolitionist. Now, he would make the concession, as he did at one point, when someone asked him, no, I'm not an abolitionist, he said, but I'm mighty near one.
Putting his
And-
hand on Thomas Alsop's shoulder, right?
Right, yeah. And he says to Charles Sumner, no question about Sumner's bona fides as an abolitionist. And he says to Sumner, well, I'm really only about 6 weeks behind you. Probably a bit of an exaggeration, but nevertheless, he's not there in the front rank of the abolitionists. The abolitionists know that. When he is elected in 1860, the response of a number of the abolitionists is anything but hooray and hallelujah. To the contrary, Wendell Phillips describes him as the slave hound of Illinois because he would not repudiate the fugitive slave law. And in fact, when Lincoln stands up to deliver his inaugural address, he says, I've got no intention of interfering with slavery in the states where it's legal. I'll enforce the fugitive slave law. Oh, by the way, I'll do it so long as there's due process. That was an important caveat. Due process. Well, the fugitive slave law didn't provide for due process. Moreover, due process only applies to citizens. Now just think of how that went over in the mind of Roger Brooke Tawney, sitting right behind Lincoln on that inaugural platform. If that wasn't a discreet way of poking two fingers in Tawney's eyes, I don't know what was. But it still doesn't make him an abolitionist.
Right. And if I could just add a footnote to that very capable survey of the question. One of the things that modern audiences find hard to accept and to understand is that there were a lot of people who were genuinely and deeply committed to the abolition, to getting rid of slavery, to abolishing slavery, but who at the same time were racist by our standards, who believed that Black people were inferior, biologically inferior, morally and intellectually inferior. And Lincoln never, ever said that Black people are inferior to white people, except in one respect. And that was in terms of color. Well, what's an inferior color? I think that's a way of mocking racists by making that kind of concession.
If you want to see an example, by the way, of what Michael is talking about, there's probably no more glaring example than Benjamin Franklin Wade, Bluff Ben Wade of Ohio, radical Republican, abolitionist, and yet his letters, his conversation is littered with racial pejoratives, with dismissive comments about Black people. How you reconcile these two, I can't begin to give you an algorithm for. But nevertheless, there it was, even in the life and the words of someone that we would otherwise think of as a radical Republican abolitionist.
Right. And Orestes Brownson, a shrewd observer of the contemporary scene, said that there's the North is 75% anti-slavery and 90% anti-Black.
Yeah.
Now, we don't have public opinion polls in those days, but that seems, based on what we know from the newspapers and correspondence and diaries and all that, pretty accurate.
I guess there's if you're talking about somebody that wants equality, how do you define equality? There's political equality, social equality, opportunity equality. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects of that. And I think, we've seen, as Alan and Michael were saying, there were people who were all for ending slavery, but not so keen on giving full equality to those people that were now free. So it's right. Very difficult.
And if I could add another little footnote here, put yourself in Lincoln's shoes. In 1858, he's running for the Senate in Illinois. Illinois is arguably the most negrophobic state in the Union. Lincoln thinks there are two evils. One is slavery. 4 million people are enslaved. The other is second-class citizenship for free Blacks, maybe 250,000 in the northern states. Can you attack both of those evils simultaneously? Well, sure, if you're in New Hampshire or Massachusetts, but not in Illinois. So you have to decide which one are you going to focus on. And if 4 million slaves, it's a more pressing and widespread problem than the 250,000 who have second-class citizenship. So that in order to defeat Stephen A. Douglas, and Lincoln believed that defeating Stephen A. Douglas was not just something that he needed to do in order to enhance his resume and to allow him to become a senator. It was because Douglas was the most sinister person in the country, the most formidable opponent of the anti-slavery movement. And if he weren't defeated, that would have profound consequences for the whole country, not just for his political career. And so he felt it necessary, after Douglas hammered him and hammered him and hammered him about his original statement at the beginning of the campaign, where he said, let's abandon all this. Lincoln gets up and says in Chicago in front of a huge crowd, let's stop all this quibbling about this race being superior and that race being inferior, and therefore that race has to be placed in an inferior position. And let's all unite once again behind the good old Declaration of Independence and agree that all men are created equal. And then Douglas goes after him. Well, that means you believe in black intermarriage with whites and black voting rights and black right to hold office and right to serve on juries. And Lincoln couldn't just not respond to that if he was going to have any chance of winning. And so he pays lip service to the black code that exists in Illinois. He says, I do not oppose black, I do not support black voting rights or jury or service or intermarriage with white or the like. But that's formulaic lip service. What Lincoln is emphasizing is, look, the thing that's before us today in Illinois is not, should black people have citizenship rights, is slavery right or is slavery wrong? Are all men created equal or all men not created equal? And if you believe that if you do not agree that slavery is evil and that black people are among those who are all men are created equal, vote for them. If you accept that, vote for us. But let's not muddy the waters by talking about citizenship rights. That's not on the table now.
So that brings up a couple of people have brought out that Illinois and the North in general, but Illinois, which had pretty strict black laws, really was almost three states, in that the North was much more open to ending slavery. The South was much more pro-slavery, and the middle was a kind of a mix. That's true in the North in general, right? That maybe not the North or South difference, but there were plenty of people in the North who were very pro-slavery.
Well, we have to think of the North and the Union cause as it was being waged during the war is in three layers. You've got the upper North, the lower North, and the border states. And each one of those was more or less equally in terms of population and economic resource. They're all three important, but they're very different when it comes to questions of slavery and race. The upper North, all for anti-slavery, the lower North, not so much, and the border states, less indeed.
One of the jarring discoveries you make, especially in the months after the end of the war, is that although this is a war which has been fought in large measure over slavery, and which has come to its conclusion with a 13th Amendment to the Constitution banning slavery, yet within months of the end of the war, ballot initiatives in three states in the North to grant voting rights to black people are lost. And you look at those results and you think, wait a minute, the war was fought to point us in a very different direction, but not for a lot of people in those states. There were many people who wanted to save the Union. There were many people who wanted to save American democracy from the destruction that they thought the Southern oligarchy was going to inflict on it. That did not necessarily mean that they were willing and eager to embrace black voting rights, black equality, and especially black economic competition.
And the thing that seems to have been most on the minds of Illinois voters, when you have that list of things that were forbidden by the black codes, in 1865, Illinois gets rid of many of the features of the black code, except for the ban on interracial marriage. And time and again, that's the argument that the racists would use against Republicans. You wouldn't want your sister to marry one, would you? It's just that crude.
But when Jim Gillen asked, he said, didn't Lincoln in one of the debates say that they thought there was a physical difference between whites and blacks that would prevent social equality? What did he mean by that?
Well, what Lincoln was saying is that not that black people are inferior to white people, but that black people and white people are incompatible in the ability to get along with one another.
When Lincoln talks about a physical difference, Michael earlier alluded to Lincoln's definition of that in terms of color, which means exactly what? What is there inherent about a particular hue to another. Then the other thing is, all right, he's going to say, yes, I believe there is a physical difference. He never stops to define what that physical difference is. And that, again, that's simply left floating out there. I believe there is a physical difference. There are other people who went very, very much further than that. There were people who thought they had identified the physical difference. The physical difference was, in fact, a difference of species, that Black people and white people really were not people in the same sense. That, in fact, we're talking about two entirely different species. And if you want to see how this kind of thinking blossoms, especially in the South, you only have to look at DeBow's review. You only have to look at the Southern Quarterly Review, and you find this kind of thing. And they, in turn, are drawing from the resources of European racial thinking in terms of, for instance, Arthur de Gobineau's huge exploration of the idea of racial and ethnic difference. And these are people who are almost on the brink of saying, and sometimes are over the brink of saying, that we're really not even talking about the same human race. We're really talking about two entirely different species, and really they shouldn't even be thought of in the same category.
And Lincoln really hammers Stephen A. Douglas by saying that you're dehumanizing the Black people.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, this is this not always the formula that dictatorship and oppression takes? The first step it takes is dehumanize the people that you want to oppress. And isn't this the pattern that we see worked out time and time and time again, when one group of people with power in their hands uses it to oppress others? You do it. You justify the doing of it by saying, well, you know, they're really not human. They, of course, can almost mean anything. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, we've seen a number of people, sad to say, a number of different ethnic groups who have been nominated for that dehumanization. And the result has almost uniformly been catastrophic.
Rod Ross asks for you, Ellen. So when you spoke of economic independence for the formerly enslaved, he was impressed with your description of the Freedmen's Bureau vision. Would Lincoln have had any sympathy for payments per se to the formerly enslaved for their pre-Civil War work without wages? I guess some sort of immediate reparations or something.
It's not a question that ever crosses his screen per se. There were a few people who did allude to this. Thaddeus Stevens, for instance, wanted to talk about some kind of reparative payments being made to slaves, although the suggestion itself is vague enough that it never really develops any kind of legs in terms of legislation. Lincoln never explicitly talks about reparations. What he does talk about, though, is securing the freed slaves the opportunity to farm land, to own land, to make their own worlds and their own lives for themselves. In 1864, he writes a memo for his cabinet and for a number of his military officers, warning against meddling with or trying to impose restrictions on the Blacks who were farming for themselves on the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina. He is, in that respect, he's very protective of their liberty to earn for themselves. So he's not really thinking in terms of redistribution or transfer payments. What he is thinking, though, is making sure that people have the opportunity and the means and the resources to earn for themselves, something that they had never been permitted to have before.
And an allied point is the one that he makes in the penultimate paragraph of the second inaugural, that this terrible injustice has to be atoned for somehow, and that he doesn't understand why the war has gone on so long, why there have been so many men killed, why there have been so many widows and orphans created. And God could have stopped this war before it began. He could stop it at any point along the history of the war, but it goes on and on and on, and people keep dying, and it's incomprehensible. And so he writes a memo to himself to that effect. But then in the second inaugural, he answers that publicly by saying that, well, and I paraphrase, that the war is going to go on until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with a sword, and until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk. and doesn't say that that's why the war has definitely, that's why the war has lasted so long and there's been so much bloodshed, so many whites have died. But he says, if that's true, then the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, as the psalmist said.
If there's a moment at which Lincoln talks about something that we might call reparations, it's that moment in the second inaugural, when he talks about every drop of blood drawn by the sword, or drawn by the lash, being paid for. Right? He uses this commercial metaphor, being paid for by those by an equal number of drops of blood drawn by the sword. That for him is the great national reparations. And of course, it has to be national in his view. It's not something that Southerners have to do, because why? Both North and South alike have had a guilty role to play in the institution of American slavery. So the war is a visitation, a divine visitation on the entire nation, to which we submit, to which we offer up the sacrifice of 4 years of warfare. If there is a moment when he does talk about something we could call reparations, that is it. But it's a reparation that he sees in the colossal losses of the war itself.
Someone pointed out that 2 points. One, that the South would still have an economy based on cotton, most likely, and that the South were more, the white population of the South had lived with a greater number of Black population than did in the North. In most of the North, there was very small Black population. And therefore, maybe they would be able to reach agreement on a way to find this new relations better than people in the North who didn't have as much experience. Do you think that would have happened? I mean, you have places like South Carolina, I think, Mississippi, something like 80% African-American population at the beginning of the Civil War.
Well, certainly at the end of the war, the expectation of many Northerners was that the cotton economy of the South was itself an artificial creation of this quasi-monarchical Southern oligarchy, that Southerners had kept the Southern states in bondage to cotton agriculture because really Southern slave owners felt themselves to be more akin to British monarchists and the British economy than they did to a free labor society. The expectation of many Northerners is, well, now the war is over. Now we Northerners can go south with investment. We can build up industry. We can turn the South into what the North has been, which is increasingly a small producer industrial economy. Now, mind you, the North wasn't exactly what we imagine it to be by what it became in the 1890s, that big industrial behemoth. It was not that in the 1860s, but it was much more a case of low-level, small-scale manufacturing. That was very typical of the North, and the expectation was this is what we're going to go and do in the South. We were not able to do that beforehand because the cotton oligarchs would not let us. The cotton oligarchs wanted to rule over a quasi-monarchy, and to do that, they want to keep the South backwards, agricultural, and bound to cotton. Well, the end of the war is over. We're going to go south. Many of us Northerners are going to go south, and we're going to replicate the Northern economy in the South. Well, that does not happen. Not because it couldn't have, but because so many of those Southern oligarchs at the end of the war are still the same people owning the same land. And they're able to turn back the effort of Northerners to come and invest in the South and create this kind of small-scale economy. When you look, for instance, at how the Ku Klux Klan operates in the Carolinas, yes, the Ku Klux Klan is busy terrorizing Black voters. They're also busy torching Northern enterprises, Northern storekeepers, Northern railroads that are trying to establish a new kind of foothold, a new kind of economy in the South. And they're torching that with as much enthusiasm as they are terrorizing Black voters. So the understanding of the old oligarchy of the South was, we're going to try to keep the post-war South as close to the model of the old pre-war South as we possibly can. And they certainly did. In fact, the South remains economically the most backwards region of the United States, well up until the 20th century, really up until the middle of the 20th century. And that was a deliberate decision made by Southern Democratic leadership at the end of the war and in the absence of an effective Reconstruction policy.
So effectively, you would have had to see Lincoln find allies in the South. So David Saylor brings this up and he says, yeah, we'd have to find Southern-based allies to improve over what did happen. Who could have been those allies during Reconstruction? I mean, you just said the plantation owners certainly weren't lining up to be allies with this.
No, but the solution is twofold. One is you take seriously the confiscation of property owned by traders. You do everything within your power to include to promote those traders leaving the United States, going into exile. As many as 10,000 Confederates went into exile in Mexico and other places. I mean, a number of them sought employment with the ill-fated Emperor Maximilian in Mexico. And they knew what side they were fighting on. They knew they were fighting on the side of aristocracy and oligarchy. Lincoln would have encouraged them to just go. And in the process, then there could have been the possibility of some kind of reapportionment of the Southern economy. The other thing is, all right, there's a push. All right, what about a pull? What about all the federal offices which would need to find appointees in the South at the end of the Civil War? Well, you know, a federal salary for a federal marshal, for a postmaster, could really do wonders at changing your political beliefs. It could really persuade you to take a very different view of Black people than you had before. I mean, you could go to bed one night as an unreconstructed Confederate and the next day wake up in receipt of a federal salary and suddenly you become a new man. And if you think that doesn't happen politically, friends, you're in the District of Columbia. Look around.
And there's another aspect of Lincoln's thinking that I believe is underappreciated. That is, he makes a suggestion to that toward the very end of the war, that Southerners should be compensated very generously for the abolition of slavery, and that this is sometime. And it was the Congress was uninterested, the cabinet wasn't interested. What Lincoln and sometimes people say, "What the hell's gone in his mind?" Well, he was thinking of a Marshall Plan, in effect. That what the South needs is capital, among other things. And that's one way to get it there. But the public was in no mood to provide it.
Yes, you have to think that emancipation does not just free slaves. In freeing slaves, it also liquidates the single largest capital asset that the Southern economy possessed. We're talking about something on the order of $6 billion. That's $1865. And I have seen estimates that have pushed that figure up to as high as $13 billion. That kind of loss of capital would have to be compensated for in some other way, simply to make an economy work. Where else was that going to come from? Well, it would have to come from a Reconstruction plan that Lincoln was going to have to put in place. But it's a Reconstruction plan that Andrew Johnson simply has no comprehension of.
Was a plantation, were plantations profitable? I mean, you suggested that there's a lot of the net worth of plantation owners was tied up in people, in enslaved people. And I recall that Thomas Jefferson, when he died in debt. And in your book, when you talk about Robert E. Lee, his father-in-law, George Washington Parke Custis, died and left quite a bit of debt. Was that the norm for plantations? How could they seem so rich and be so profitable if they were so far in debt?
It had become more of the norm in the northern Upper South. It had become more of that norm in places like Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, even parts of North Carolina, because slave agriculture had worn the soils out over the decades, and slavery was losing its grip. Now, if you shifted your point of view to the Mississippi Valley, to what we then called the Southwest, then it's very different. The soils of the Mississippi Valley are the greatest cotton growing soils in the world. And there, entrepreneurs moving into Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, with only the smallest capital startup could within a few years be realizing annual returns of up to 30 to 35%. In those places, cotton could be extremely valuable. And those were the people who had the whip handle of the Confederacy. If you look across the northern rim of the Confederacy, that's where you have, that's where slavery is really starting to lose its grip. And it's one major reason why the border slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, balk at the notion finally of joining the Confederacy. Slavery simply doesn't have the power in those states that it once had. But as they are losing power, as slavery is losing control of those states, it's multiplying that control in the lower Mississippi Valley and along the Gulf Coast. And of course, it's the Gulf Coast southern states, which are the ones who bolt first in secession.
And one of the ironic factors that kept the Upper South, that is to say Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, in the Union was the Fugitive Slave Act. They realized that if they pulled out of the Union, that immediately every slave who made it across the Mason-Dixon line or the Ohio River would be free, and there was no Fugitive Slave Act and then returned. So when Lincoln talks about I will enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, it was in part anyway to appeal to that sense of self-interest that the people in the Upper South states had, the border states.
Bear in mind always, there's an elephant in the room when we're talking about abolishing slavery, when we're talking about emancipation. And that elephant in the room is the federal judiciary. Any effort by Lincoln to take dramatic steps towards emancipation was always going to run afoul of the federal judiciary. Because, for instance, if Lincoln wanted to emancipate slaves in Kentucky, all right, he could get up one morning and sign some kind of document and say, all right, we're going to free all the slaves in Kentucky. By 9 o'clock the next morning, every slave owner in Kentucky would be knocking on the door of a federal court demanding an injunction. Because what right did Abraham Lincoln have to emancipate slaves? Slaves were slaves by virtue of state codes, not by any kind of federal statute. Well, they go into the federal courts, they get appealed to the district courts, and sooner or later they wind up at the United States Supreme Court. And who is the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court? Roger Brooke Taney. So Lincoln understands, if he takes one step out of the straight and narrow, legally speaking, on slavery, then Roger Taney is going to have an opportunity to destroy every possibility, every expectation of emancipation for another 50 years. This is why, and what is one of the most curious details in all of Lincoln's career. This is why in November of 1862, Lincoln offers to buy a slave. Yes, that's right. I did not misspeak myself. Lincoln offers to buy a slave. Why does he offer to buy the slave? Because he's really just a racist at heart, never really had any kind of commitment to emancipation. That's what some people have said. That's because they haven't read very carefully. He offers to buy this slave because this particular slave has become the potential eye of a legal storm in Kentucky. And Lincoln is concerned that that legal storm could derail the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which he'd only issued 2 months before. So what does he do? He tries to cut the Gordian knot and offer, I'll buy the slave. In other words, I'll get him off the chessboard, the legal chessboard, so to speak. Now, the owner of that slave refused. He was going to try and make a legal contest out of it. But it is one of the oddest moments. What that underscores is that Lincoln has a very careful, canny, shrewd eye on what the legal possibilities were and what the legal path toward emancipation was. And a great deal of what people try to say is half-heartedness or racism on Lincoln's part. There's nothing of the sort. It's really Lincoln being an extremely shrewd, or as Herndon would say, long-headed lawyer, understanding the legal ramifications of every step that he takes.
Particularly issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. One of the favorite criticisms of Lincoln among his critics is to sneer at the language of the Emancipation Proclamation because it was so legalistic and didn't have the kind of moral uplift that everybody wanted. Well, which Lincoln, of course, was an expert at, those magnificent speeches in the 1850s. But it was a legal document. It had to stand up in court.
Yeah.
And if it was justified on the basis of humanitarian concerns, it wouldn't have won. But if you can justify it on the basis of military necessity under the provisions of the Constitution, as it existed in wartime, then it was legal.
The Gettysburg Address, the first inaugural, the second inaugural, beautiful pieces of eloquence, marvelous pieces of rhetoric. You can't take them into a court of law and do anything with them. But the Emancipation Proclamation, I say to my students frequently, you know what kills the Emancipation Proclamation for a lot of people who read it the first time? It's the first word, whereas. Whoever got excited about a document that begins whereas? I mean, I'm sorry, Kurt, unless you're an attorney, but whereas, Richard Hofstadter, in this horrible bon mot that he coined in 1948, said that the Emancipation Proclamation had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. Well, you know something? There is something grand about a bill of lading if it's a bill of lading that's going to transport 3 million people from slavery to freedom.
Well put.
That's a good segue because Frederick Douglass was not a real big fan of the Emancipation Proclamation because it didn't actually free slaves in the border states or in any of the free states. So that kind of is a segue into Michael's book. And I hope Michael's still there because my screen just missed and suddenly disappeared. There you are. Okay, so your book is called The Black Man's President.
Right.
And I understand that the original title was Emphatically the Black Man's President.
That's true.
And that statement, that title comes from Frederick Douglass at his eulogy to Lincoln in 1865, where he talks about Lincoln as being representative, being the black man's president, certainly more than anybody prior to that.
Right.
And yet, in 1876, when he's dedicating the Emancipation Memorial, the statue that's been controversial again here in Washington, D.C. recently, he says he's let me get the right word. He's the white man's president, predominantly the white man's president.
Preeminently, right.
Preeminently the white man's president. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, and he contradicted himself a couple other places there. I mean, do you think that Douglas's view of Lincoln had changed over that interim, or was he more kind of playing the political game in both or either of those timeframes to try to move the politics the way he wanted it to go?
Well, I believe that the reason why there is such a dramatic contrast between the 1865 eulogy, in which Lincoln is described as preeminently, as emphatically the black man's president, to the 1876 speech on Capitol Hill, where he says that Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president, is this: that in 1876, in April, when that statue was dedicated, there was a huge black turnout because it was a monument. It was created by blacks, by money raised by blacks, and by a sculptor who was commissioned by blacks. But also the power elite was there, the president, leading members of the cabinet and Congress, members of the Supreme Court. And what what Frederick Douglass did was to appeal to the power elite, the white power elite. And his subtext was, this is my interpretation, I think it's valid, is, look, don't let Reconstruction go down the drain. Reconstruction But by 1876, the Northern support for Reconstruction was waning dramatically, in large part because of a depression that struck, and also in part of just weariness with the subject. And Douglas was alarmed, as well he should have been. And he said, so he's saying to the president and the cabinet and the Congress and the court, don't let this Reconstruction effort fail, because it was started by Lincoln. When he called for Black voting rights, he set the ball in motion. And the reason he did that is because he was your guy. He was devoted to the interests of the white race. And he realized that it was in the interest of the white race to have the Black race enjoy first-class citizenship. So don't let this go down the drain. And so I think that his insistence that Lincoln was devoted to the interests of the white race and we Black people were only his stepchildren was a way to wrap that message in a way that would be more emphatic and more understandable to the power elite than his true feelings. Because if you look at Frederick Douglass's post-assassination assessments of Lincoln, they're almost all favorable. But in this speech, this preeminently the white man's president, and then he goes on to say he shared the prejudices of the white people. But then in 1865, he says he's the first president to rise above the prejudices of his time and his country. Now, and in the conclusion of the 1876 speech, as you well know, David, he says, if you judge Lincoln by the standard of the abolitionists, he was slow and tardy and cold and all that. But if you judge him by the standard of the people that he represented and whose views he had to take into account, he was swift and zealous and determined. And so the larger point is, don't compare Lincoln to the abolitionist tiny minority. Compare him to the constituents whose interests he had to represent.
It's interesting to watch Douglas's comments on Lincoln's zigzag over the years. When he first begins to talk about Lincoln, when Lincoln is elected, it's very critical. Then when he meets Lincoln for the first time in 1863, a lot of that criticism falls away. He is almost surprised out of his socks at the way Lincoln not only welcomes him to the White House, but listens to him. I mean, Lincoln doesn't just deliver a lecture to him. He listens to what Douglas has to say. And that's the first of several times that Lincoln and Douglas will meet. And yet, at the very same moment, you get the zigzag. In 1865, that speech, that eulogy at Cooper Union, he'll talk about emphatically the Black man's president. Then at the dedication of the Thomas Ball Emancipation statue, it's predominantly the white man's president. But then you trace him later. You look at the essay that he writes for Alan Thorndike Rice's North American Review, and it's, Lincoln in no way reminded me of the difference of color between it. He was the first great man in America I met who didn't remind me that way. And you look at the most famous oration that Douglas gave in his life, Self-Made Men, which he must have, I think that Douglas must have delivered that upwards of 200 times in his lifetime. The centerpiece of Self-Made Men is Abraham Lincoln and how we can all aspire to the example of Abraham Lincoln. So there's a zigzag here. And one thing which I think plays into the zag, if I may, for the Ball Emancipation statue dedication. The person who really orchestrated the dedication ceremonies was John Mercer Langston. There was not always the happiest relationship between Langston and Frederick Douglass. And there is bubbling beneath the surface, there is a subtext of rivalry, as though Douglas is not going to give an oration which makes John Mercer Langston's project look like it's the greatest thing imaginable. No, he's going to slip something in here which is going to say, well, but maybe, perhaps, somehow. And this is what Douglas does. And the day afterwards, he gives a comment that appears in the Washington National Republican, where he says, well, I don't know about that statue. It could have been better this way, it could have been better that way. Is this sour grapes? Is Frederick Douglass immune to sour grapes? No, any more than any of the rest of us are. I think we have to understand there is a little frisson of tension between himself and John Mercer Langston and the overall committee that is responsible for organizing the ceremonies for the Bull statue.
Oh, that's a brilliant insight. I
Yeah.
hadn't thought of that.
So there's zigzagging in Douglas's opinion of Lincoln, and you have to take the zigs and you have to take the zag, and you're going to have to figure out why it happens this way, because Douglas is a very complicated person. There's no single voice of Frederick Douglass. The man was too complex. The man was too variegated in his interests and his talents, simply to be always singing the same aria. You know, Pavarotti might have always sung Nessun Dorma, but Frederick Douglass has got other songs that he sings from time to time. And it's important to listen to Douglass because, as I say, what you're hearing are the thoughts, the words, and the heart of a very complicated and complex American.
And the most savage criticism that he ever made of Lincoln was apropos of the meeting that Lincoln had on August 14th, 1862, with those 5 Black leaders of the Washington community, whom he tried to encourage to be pioneers in a colonization effort in Panama. And Douglas goes off the deep end. He's a hopeless redneck and racist, and things have never been worse. It's really savage. And you've got Henry McNeil Turner and Henry Highland Garnett and other Black leaders are saying, this is great stuff that Lincoln is saying. What people don't realize is that when Lincoln proposed that Panama colonization plan that Douglas denounced savagely, 2 out of Douglas's 3 adult sons joined it. Mm-hmm. And you think, wait a minute, if Lincoln was a hopeless redneck mother, why are Douglas's adult sons joining this effort?
Okay, I want to transition a little bit because you guys have been nice enough to stay with us for quite a long time, and I don't know how much more stamina you have, but there's still more questions. But I also want to get to Ellen's new book as well. But I want to ask this question that was asked by John Anderson quite early in Ellen's presentation, but I've been kind of holding it as a mechanism for a segue. But John Anderson asked, if Lincoln had lived, would he have shown more empathy for the sacrifice the Confederate families made for their dead, and possibly ordered Congress, for example, to bury all of the Civil War dead properly after the war, including Confederate soldiers, hence lessening the need for the Daughters of the Confederacy, United Daughters Confederacy, to take up that need? So would Lincoln have been had more empathy for the Confederate dead and their families than did Johnson or the rest of the North?
Lincoln can be very unpredictable this way. He stands up at Gettysburg at the Soldiers' National Cemetery and delivers the dedication remarks there. At a cemetery where only Union dead are buried. Actually, there were 7 Confederates buried there, but that had been by accident, so that didn't count. He's dedicating a cemetery for the Union dead, and his comments are all about the Union cause and what the Union is fighting for. And there's no sense whatsoever in the Gettysburg Address where he's talking about, well, let's embrace the Confederate dead as well. That just isn't there. To the contrary, he has this moment in 1864, which is something about, he treats it humorously, but there's a sharp edge to it, in which he asks the question, which is being posed to him by a Southern woman. And he responds to the question by saying that he doesn't really think it's a particularly religious act for someone to have spent the years of the war waging war against their own national government. You know, that's not something laudatory that you should appeal to God to justify. So there were moments when he could, in fact, be very unempathetic. And those were moments when the authority of the Union was being challenged. Would he have buckled after the war, so to speak? Would he have shown the kind of magnanimity that would say, well, let's bury the Confederate dead along with the Union dead and give them equal honor? I'm not too sure about that. The losses in the war were so great. And on the Confederate side, the possibilities of what would have occurred had they been successful are too enormous to contemplate. That I have some difficulty imagining Lincoln simply giving carte blanche to reconciliation with the South. There were many people after the war who thought that the way to heal all the wounds was to treat it as simply a bad moment of misunderstanding, and let's all see if we can get together. I'm not really sure that that was Lincoln's view of things. And would that have translated into a view of things very different after the war? Again, that's one of the imponderables. But Lincoln certainly believed that with the end of active fighting, the war was only entering another phase, and that is its political phase. And in that respect, I don't think that he would have been eager to make too much in the way of concessions. No malice. What I do, he said to Cuthbert Bullitt in 1862, was, what I'm dealing with is too great for malice. Not with malice, with charity. But even charity has its boundaries.
And that is reflected in the way he talked about Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, as you know better than anybody, Alan. That he refers to Lee as Bobby Lee and Jeffy Davis, and then when Stonewall Jackson dies, he has positive things to say about him, and so Lincoln didn't bear malice, but as Alan was suggesting, to go so far in the opposite in the direction of actually honoring the Confederate dead by having them buried, and that does seem like a bridge too far.
I think that Lincoln he also during the war, he was very quick to empathize with soldiers who maybe had gone AWOL, and the penalty for that was death. And he was always looking for ways not to put them to death. On the other hand, if somebody were guilty of murder or rape or something that he felt was very egregious, he was very quick to not give them any width, including the first and only slave trader to be hanged, which he had an opportunity to let him go and didn't. So I guess if you could look at it and say, well, if he thought that you had been grossly wrong, egregiously wrong, then he might not have given you much leeway. Which gets me to Alan's books. I want to give Alan a chance to talk about his book. This is Alan's newest book. It's Robert E. Lee, A Life, that came out this past year, this fall. And it's an excellent book. We had at this roundtable, we had Ty Sigilay, who had written a book called Robert E. Lee and Me, which is more of a kind of a history and memoir mixed together. And he was very much adamant that Lee was a traitor. And he, all the things that he had learned growing up were just totally false and everything. And I think in this book, Alan, you're a much more nuanced Robert E. Lee and a much more complete Robert E. Lee. But you do say at the beginning, and you mention it throughout, and then reiterate at the end, that Lee was a traitor to his country. That he and others were guilty of treason. At the same time, he was poised and honorable, things that would be good. He kind of thought that slavery was immoral, maybe. And yet he had his own or his family's escaped slaves whipped. And he was clearly thought that Black people were inferior to white peoples. He's a white supremacist. Aren't these things kind of contradictory? I mean, are they something that could exist in a single person?
Well, yes, because human nature itself has all of these, shall we say, all these apertures. Human nature is not straightforward. People are not simple, and especially someone who had the talents, the education, the aptitudes of a Robert E. Lee. I have to confess, I had some anxiety with doing the Lee book, that my Lincoln friends were going to think that I'd gone over to the dark side. It's more a case. I was talking several months ago to Joe Gladhar, who of course wrote a wonderful study, two wonderful studies of the Army of Northern Virginia. And Joe said to me at one point, "Well, I've done my Confederate book," and his project now is to do something likewise for the Army of the Potomac. Well, okay, I've done my Confederate book. Lee is not in any way like writing about Lincoln. And the quick contrast I would draw would be this. Robert E. Lee is a complicated person, but he is not a complex one. Whereas Abraham Lincoln is both complicated and complex. You can spend a lot of time in the company of Abraham Lincoln. Most of us have. And still find new things, new insights, new ways of understanding and appreciating this extraordinary and remarkable man. With Robert E. Lee, it's very difficult that way. And Lee is not simplistic, but at the same time, there really is not depth there. There's not a depth that you can spend a lot of time with. I use the word about him. I use the word treason about him. And that has flustered a few people who have written to me politely on the subject. But I use the word advisedly because I don't have a better word. The Constitution defines treason as making war on the United States and giving aid and comfort to its enemies. And I cannot look at what Robert E. Lee did and see that in any other light. I simply can't. My book is a little different from Robert E. Lee and me because I'm not a Southerner. I'm a Yankee. I'm a Yankee from Yankee land. And so I come at Robert E. Lee in a very different framework from many of his biographers. But looking at Lee in that respect, I don't see a halo. What I do see is a man who made a dramatically wrong decision, trying to read the stars in April of 1861 and reading them wrong and trying to live with the consequences of that. But that does not necessarily make him noble. So yes, I've tried to write in a nuanced way about Lee, and I have used the word treason because I think it has to be used. But at the same time, I also want to use two other words, which I use at the very end of the book. One is compassion and the other is will. I'm using John Gardner's formula. No true compassion without will. In other words, you have to have the will to judge, particularly as a historian. You have to have the will to make judgments. You have to have the will to say, this was wrong, or this was right. Only then can you have compassion. But at the same time, Gardner went on to say, there is no true will without compassion. You can't exercise that kind of historical judgment without at the same time seeking the spirit of compassion in which to do it. And I think you might say that the Lee book is a very long effort at trying to exercise both of those and show how you use them to understand historical personages. And I think not just Lee, I think also of many others with great flaws, but also great accomplishments.
And if I could add a footnote as a biographer myself, the point of a biographer is to make the actions and words and thoughts of people in the past understandable to a modern audience, which is not the same thing as saying to forgive or to palliate or to excuse. There is a belief in some circle that is to understand all is to forgive all. That's simply not true. And it's very easy to approach history with a wagging finger and saying this person was evil and that person was good and all that. And but so what? So for example, Adolf Hitler was a monster. Okay, if you say that, that's mildly interesting. But how in the hell did a country like Germany produce such a monster? And so to understand all is not to forgive all.
I wrote a lengthy op-ed back in September in the New York Times about this business of writing difficult biography. And it's funny that Michael should mention the Hitler example, because Ian Kershaw, a biographer of Hitler, dealt with this very issue in the beginning of his 2-volume biography of Adolf Hitler. He said one of the great problems that any biographer has is to be a good biographer, you have to be able to enter into the thinking and the life of that person. But in so doing, how do you avoid at the same time becoming complicit, condoning, providing excuse for? You know, that's a very, very difficult path to walk when you're writing difficult biography. Well, Lee is an example of the writing of difficult biography. At the same time, though, and this is what I went on to say in the op-ed, you can't avoid writing difficult biography. You just can't say, all right, there's a whole category of people we're never going to write biography about, because that's all that does is invite A, ignorance, and B, repetition of their monstrosities. You have to write difficult biography. So how do you do it? And you set yourself to it, and you try to set up these guidelines and these ways of understanding the biographer's task.
Yeah, it's very difficult to deal with that. Let me ask you one more thing about Lee, in part because the Lincoln Group has what we call a study forum, which is basically a book study group. And we tackled Michael Burlingame's Green Monster in 2 different time periods. Took quite a long time to get through them. But the next book that we are just starting, because this is the 200th anniversary of Ulysses S. Grant's birth.
That's right.
So we're going off the range a little bit to read Chuck Calhoun's book on the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. And I'm not a Grant expert or person, and I'm not a Lee person. I'm not even a Civil War battle person. I'm a Lincoln person. But it's kind of fascinating to go off and read these from different perspectives. And reading about Lee in your book, it really, for one thing, I learned a lot that I didn't know about Lee, and learned how little I knew about Lee. But it strikes me as you present it in his early days, especially in the military, in the Corps of Engineers, and out in the Mississippi River, dealing with the 2 islands, including Bloody Island, and where, in a sense, basically that he was a very good engineer.
Yeah. By the way, Bloody Island was not too very far away from where James Shields and Lincoln were going to fight their notorious duel.
Exactly, and that's why I enjoy reading about Bloody Island in your book. But so he's a very good engineer, and even I think when he goes after the war and he becomes president of Washington College, now Washington and Lee University, that he even approaches that as an engineer would approach things, and looks at it, so how do we fix this, and how do we make it better? So I think you made a very good case that he's a very good engineer. I'm wondering if you think that he was a very good general.
Well, there are basically 3 ways you can evaluate generals, military commanders: strategic, tactical, and logistical. Strategic, I think that Lee was probably the best thing the Confederacy had, because Lee really did see the big picture. And the big picture was this: the Confederacy lacked the resources to go a long distance war. It was going to have to strike quickly in the early rounds and score a surprise knockout if it was going to achieve its independence. And he saw that. And that was why when he takes command and he has an opening, he takes his Army of Northern Virginia across the Potomac, not once, but twice, and would have done it a third time in 1864 if Grant hadn't anticipated him. As a tactical commander, he's harder to read because he really didn't like tactical command. His own professional advice was, my job is to bring my army to a particular battlefield, and then it's the job of my subordinates to fight the battle, which is great when you've got subordinates like Longstreet and Jackson. It becomes more of a difficulty for him later in the war, when he doesn't have people that he can rely on easily, and when he has to take tactical control. And the moments when he does have to do that, clearly he does not find it really very appealing. Logistically, probably this is the point at which he shines least. And that's largely because at the logistical and operational level, that's where a general has to interface with the political people. And he had a deep aversion, running back to examples he'd seen in his professional career. He had a deep aversion to challenging the politicians. So his army is going barefoot, his army is going hungry, but he does not go to Jefferson Davis and say, you're going to have to get rid of Lucius Northrop. You're going to have to get rid of Abraham Myers. These people are starving your army. No, he doesn't do that. He won't confront the politicians. So in that respect, he's probably is least successful in terms of logistics and operations. Strategically, though, he is the one who really sees what the story of the Confederacy is going to have to be if it's going to survive.
There's a comment here from iPhone that says, can I ask Guelzo a Lee question about Lee's contradictory attitude towards slavery? John.
Robert E. Lee was a member of my church, and there's a story that he, in 1858, three slaves escaped. They were captured, jailed in Maryland for a couple of weeks, came back, and Robert E. Lee ordered them to be lashed, the two males 50 times, the sister 20 times, urged it on, and then ordered brine to be poured on their backs. And yet now I'm and that I know. And then in Amazon, you indicate that there was a brief portion of your description of your book in Amazon says he considered slavery immoral but benefited from inherited slaves. How could he consider slavery immoral and do that in 1858 before he became the Robert E. Lee that the nation knows?
Because he took the runaways as a personal challenge to his authority.
Okay.
The slaves at Arlington and the other two Custis properties were supposed to be freed under the terms of George Washington Parke Custis's will,
Correct.
of which Robert Lee was made the executor. But it was within a 5-year window. In the meantime, there were supposed to be $10,000 legacies paid to each of old GWP's granddaughters, Lee's daughters. And there was no money in the till at Arlington. So Lee was going to have to, he's obligated by the terms of the estate. He is going to have to make Arlington profitable again as an enterprise in order to pay those legacies and then proceed to the emancipation of the slaves. Now, the slaves at Arlington had a very different view of this. The slaves believed that they had been emancipated by the will itself. So that when Robert E. Lee takes hold of things at Arlington, and he takes hold of them as you would expect an engineer would take hold of them, they balk at this, and 3 of them run away. And when they are apprehended in Westminster, Maryland, and brought back, Lee's question to them was, what did you think you were doing? And their response was, we considered that we were as free as you are. That sets something off in Robert E. Lee. I mean, Robert E. Lee was a man for whom the word self-control is almost a definition. And yet, at the same time, he is also the son of the famous light horse Harry Lee. The same impulsive, irrational, dashing, romantic cavalry commander that George Washington regarded almost as a surrogate son, and who on one occasion really went beyond the boundaries of military decency by punishing a deserter, by cutting his head off and putting it on a pike in the middle of his camp. When Lee orders the whipping of those slaves, it's almost as though Light Horse Harry has come out of hiding in Lee's past and taken him over. And Lee orders that whipping. And he lives to regret it. Not because he thought he was wrong, but because it showed him out of control. News about this got into the New York Tribune, which of course made hay with it. It was then picked up in other anti-slavery publications, even in Britain. Lee writes to his son, George Washington Custis Lee, and says, I suppose that you have read in the papers about this incident. The only comment that Robert Lee would make to his son about it is, your grandfather has left me an unpleasant legacy. And I have not been able to help for wondering at that moment, which grandfather was he talking about? Yeah, Lee lost control at that moment. He never wanted to talk about the incident again. As the years went by, he would even try to deny that it had happened. I don't think that that's possible. But it was clear that he felt that somehow a big chunk of his character had been thrown into question. Now, feeling that some of your character has been put into question is not on the same par as having your back lashed to bloody ribbons. But I think that in large measure is what is going on at that moment. And it's not pleasant to see from any perspective.
And one thing I've failed to add, apparently George Washington Parke Custis Lee, well, Custis Lee told slaves repeatedly that verbally that they would be emancipated by his will immediately, you know, and Lee told them that no, you got to wait 5 years. So they did for months and months, and then proceeded with what we just discussed.
Right.
Can you add? Do you have anything that they verbally were led to believe by?
They may have been. We don't have any explicit evidence that GWP actually made some kind of announcement to his slaves. In fact, the emancipation provisions in the will actually came as something of a surprise. Perhaps it shouldn't have. I mean, here was the man who was the step grandson of George Washington, who really does the same thing, emancipates slaves in his will. But at the same time, could old GWP have made comments to that effect? Made what sounded like quasi-promises to his slaves? That's entirely possible. Or was it simply something that they deduced from having heard about the will, and simply in their hearing of it, did not hear a 5-year hiatus, didn't hear a 5-year window. They simply heard emancipation and assumed it was now. However it was interpreted and however it was read, Robert E. Lee was determined that things were going to be done properly, in order, and down to the letter of the law. Well, good engineer that he was. But good engineering isn't always the same as moral human relations. That's where the two come into conflict.
Excellent answer, excellent meeting. Glad we've done this.
I think you mentioned, Alan, in your book that in that will, there was stipulated also that the Custis' granddaughters, I think, if I got the right group, they were all supposed to get something like $10,000 a piece, and the money wasn't there.
No.
So Lee was part of the reason why he wasn't quick to emancipate those people was because he was hiring them out to try to raise money.
He had
And
to
then the
make,
war started, and that really kind of messed up that idea.
he had to make Arlington profitable. How were you going to do that? You were going to make the slaves work efficiently. The slaves at Arlington hadn't been working efficiently that anyone else noticed for a long time. George Washington Parke Custis was come day, go day, God send Sunday in terms of management. Now suddenly, here's his son-in-law, Robert. Okay, we're going to do this by the book of instructions. That was not what the people at Arlington had lived to expect. And suddenly it's going to be very different. Now, you know, the odd thing about this, though, is that this will of old Custis's completely eliminates Robert E. Lee. The only thing Robert E. Lee gets out of his father-in-law's will is a couple of vacant lots in the District of Columbia. For all practical purposes, Robert E. Lee is cut out of his father-in-law's will, which is a shocking decision on his part to make. So embarrassing that Custis Lee, the grandson, Robert's oldest son, actually offers to sign over Arlington to his father. I mean, he's so mortified by what his grandfather did. But Robert's response is, no, this is what your grandfather wanted, and this is how we're going to do things. And we're going to do it right down to the letter. And in fact, Robert E. Lee does. December of 1862 rolls around. Lee signs all the emancipation paperwork, all the manumission papers, and on top of it, emancipates the one slave family he owned in his own name. It was a slave family that he had inherited from his mother's estate. And he emancipates them too, even though he's not obliged to by the terms of his father-in-law's will. So Robert E. Lee, the great general of the Confederacy, from December of 1862 onwards, is a non-slaveholder. The ironies just pile up. They just pile up.
Okay, let me turn back to Michael and ask a final question, and we'll see if there are any straggling questions after that. But Michael, going back to, because of the title of your book, I want to touch base on Frederick Douglass again. Douglass said that Lincoln, quote, never shocked prejudices needlessly, unquote. And then he also said Lincoln always used the thin edge of the wedge first, and the fact that he used it at all meant that he would, if need be, use the thick as well as the thin. Can you just kind of tell us what you mean by that, and what Frederick Douglass meant by that?
Well, I think it's a way of saying that if you're going to introduce a major reform, you start off slowly. You introduce you take a moderate step, and then another step a little less moderate, and then another step a little less moderate. And for example, the way he dealt with slavery, he starts off in November of 1861, working behind the scenes to get Delaware to abolish slavery. That's the thin edge of the wedge. Well, it doesn't work. And then on March of 62, he takes the idea that he had offered to Delaware, we'll compensate the slaveholders if they agree to abolish slavery. And then he begs the border slave state representatives and senators to get their legislatures to follow through. On 3 occasions, he begs them, and then they don't move. So then he takes the wedge goes deeper. He issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, then deeper, the final Emancipation Proclamation, and then finally deeper still with the 13th Amendment. And so what I think Frederick Douglass was suggesting is that this was a first baby step on a road to mix a metaphor, on the road to full first-class citizenship.
Lincoln had another analogy, Michael, you'll remember this. He used this in a number of contexts, but he also used it about emancipation when he compared it to the Irishman in the state of Maine. State of Maine, of course, was dry.
A bit of a creature.
Right. Yeah, he says the Irishman goes into the druggists and says that I'd like a glass of sarsaparilla with a wee bit of the creature put into it, unbeknownst to myself.
So David, I did have a question, and Kurt knows why I'm asking, and Debbie Jackson knows why I'm asking. So for Michael Burlingame, either in Springfield or in Washington, D.C., did Lincoln ever have direct contact with John Willis Menard?
In Washington, Menard is one of the people who signs up to go to Panama, the Cherokee, what we call Cherokee. And then Lincoln pulls the plug on that plan because of corruption that was uncovered, and also because the states in Central America were having second thoughts. And so a bunch of people who had been enthusiastic about availing themselves of this opportunity to leave the country, go to Panama, lead a first-class citizen's life, and they sell their property, they sell their furniture, they sell their houses, and then the plug is pulled, and they're left in Washington, desperate. And so Menard and others appeal to Lincoln saying, can you please do something about this? And it's one of Lincoln's least commendable moments. A secretary comes out and says, well, the president has turned all of this over to Senator Pomeroy from Kansas, and he may get around to seeing you, but never does. So we do have his appeal, but face to face, I'm not sure that they ever met.
Wait a second. Ask Alan and Mike about how Abraham Lincoln recognized the nation of Haiti in 1862.
Well, there was a dramatic moment.
Hmm.
Previous to this, Haiti had been the nightmare of every Southern politician. Because what was Haiti? Haiti was a rebellious republic against, in this case, France, but it was a rebellious slave republic. Everybody looked at the success of the slave revolt in Haiti as presaging what would have, well, as an encouragement to slave uprisings in the United States, like Nat Turner, for instance, or Gabriel Prosser. And so Haiti was regarded as simply, well, you just don't want to encourage that sort of thing. If we recognize Haiti, it'll put ideas into the hands of our slaves here to go and do likewise. The other aspect of it that made politicians balk at recognizing Haiti was, what are you going to recognize exactly? Are the Haitians going to send diplomatic personnel to Washington? Are Black diplomatic personnel from Haiti going to mix and meet with white Americans on an equal plane? Oh, horror, horror, horror. So up until the Lincoln administration, this simply was, it wasn't even going to be considered as a possibility. With the Lincoln administration, it's entirely different. And in 1862, Haiti does get this recognition. There is the exchange of diplomatic personnel. And this doesn't seem to bother Lincoln one little bit. It almost comes off so smoothly that we hardly fathom what a really risky, dangerous political gesture that was for the Lincoln administration to do. And yet he does it. And that says a good deal, I think, about this whole complex of how Lincoln understands notions of race.
And I recently discovered something that sheds a little light on this subject, and that was Lincoln is approached after he's been elected, a month or so after he's been elected, and he's in Springfield, and Richard J. Hinton comes to Springfield. Now, Richard J. Hinton was working for the Haitian Immigration Bureau, an effort to encourage American Blacks to move to Haiti. And one of the things he was charged to do was to encourage diplomatic recognition by the United States of Haitian as an independent nation. Now, lots and lots of other countries had done that, but the United States hadn't, for the very reasons that Alan just laid out. And so Richard Hinton then comes and suggests, and he talks to a lot of different other people. He talks to Seward, he talks to Chase, he talks to Henry Lane, he talks to a lot of people, urging them to adopt or to support diplomatic recognition of Haiti. And he gets to Springfield, and he makes that same argument to Lincoln, and then he says, listen, the new president, Giffard of Haiti, understands the certain racial politics that exist in the United States. And so he's willing to send as a diplomatic representative a light-skinned Black rather than a dark-skinned Black. And Lincoln says, he says, I don't care one way or the other. What it's an educated black man would be just as acceptable as an educated, what's the term he uses? Copper colored or something of that sort. And then Hinton, who's really a radical guy. I mean, he had been hand in glove with John Brown in Kansas and at Harper's Ferry. And he says that Lincoln was more progressive or more sympathetic to the notion that hey, should be represented diplomatically than Seward and Chase. Well, now Chase was an exception, but Lane and others. And he was particularly surprised that Lincoln was so open to having any a dark-skinned diplomat come to Washington, because he lived in a state that was so negrophobic that it had an outrageous black code that even forbade black people to settle in the state. Oh, cinnamon colored, I think he said. Right?
Yeah.
What difference does it make?
By the way, Chris Gray put in links to Ellen's and Michael's book links to on Amazon, and you'll go there and you can see there are all sorts of books. And as Chris mentioned early on, these books, not all of them, obviously, but quite a few of them have won quite a few awards and book awards and very prestigious awards. So these are two men that I just want to thank personally for taking the time tonight and taking as much time as you did tonight. Okay, so I will then turn it back to Kurt, who will wrap this up, and thank you very much.
Yes, I'd like to repeat that. Thank you, Dr. Guelzo, and thank you, Dr. Burlingame, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Actually, this has been an event where we've had the most attendees since we've been doing these Zoom presentations. We still have over almost 100 attendees still.
My goodness.
Here, and we had
Wow.
at one point 160.
Holy